Okay, we're going to start just momentarily. If there's any issue, let me just share my screen so that those on the Zoom can see the share. There we go. So I am screen sharing. Okay. Okay, so this is part 3 of my series on remarkable women of the Talmud. We started with Beria, we moved on to Yalta. Today, we're going to learn about Ima Shalom. So let me paint the scene a little bit. I mentioned this on Facebook. How do you think it would feel if your brother was the Nasi of the Jewish people, and your husband was one of the greatest students of Yochanan ben Zakkai? But let me paint it a little bit further. How would it feel if you lived at a time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, at a time when there were threats to the Jewish people, pulling the Jewish people apart from the absence of a temple? Right? What does Judaism look like in the absence of a temple? Something that the Jews hadn't had to deal with in over 400 years. And at that time it was, so there's sort of this intra-Jewish fighting that always existed. Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai at that time was a real threat to the unity of the halachic Jewish community. Imagine if you had, one group of Orthodox Jews doing one set of practices, another set of Orthodox Jews doing something else, and they wouldn't marry with each other. That would be a real problem within the Jewish community, in the community of observance. Add to that the real threat that existed from sort of without, from the Judeo-Christians of the time that were trying to capitalize on this moment in history with the destruction of the temple to recruit, proselytize, strengthen this new religion, Christianity, that was at this point primarily seeking adherents from within the Jewish community. It was only later that they branched out and said, hey, there's lots of people on this planet beyond Jews, especially the pagan world, that perhaps we can expand our reach. But initially, there was a lot of focus on the Jewish community, viewing themselves as Judeo-Christians, as being the continuation, perhaps even the fulfillment of what it means to be a Jew. And so these are real threats. These are real. We're going to talk about them. Sort of think about this time period. Ima Shalom lived at the beginning, in the end of the first century. She overlapped with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And these are the stresses. These are the pulls and pushes that were going on around her. And she had a front row seat to all of that which was going on. Her name, Ima Shalom, someone we were commenting on it at the beginning, sounds a little bit like Grandma Moses, right? But, and it actually is. The suggestion is that Ima is like a surname, right? Like Mrs. Giveret, a woman of stature, like a matron, right? Like in Rome, there would be matrons. Matron was a surname of respect, and her name was Shalom. Either her name was Shalom or Shlomit or Shlom Tzion, something related to the term Shalom, and that's how she got her name, Mrs. Shalom. As I mentioned, her brother was Rabban Gamliel II, and her husband was Rabbi Eliezer ben Herkins. So we're going to spend a little bit of time painting a picture, noting some important historical events and character traits and qualities and moments in their lives that perhaps can shed some light on who Ima Shalom was, who she interacted with, and what some of her challenges and the opportunities that she had. So Ima Shalom her father was Shimon ben Gamliel. Shimon ben Gamliel was killed by the Romans during the Great Jewish Revolt that ultimately led to the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. That family, her brother, Rabban Gamliel, is known to be the first of those who were crowned, using that term loosely, as Nasi. Nasi was both a religious appointment, but also a political appointment. Rabban Gamliel was actually conferred that title by Rome, in Syria. He was, and he utilized that role through. In the Talmud, we'll find instances where Rabban Gamliel is on missions to Rome to defend, to present, to protect the Jewish community. I think Rabbi Targum might have mentioned that idea that Rabban Gamliel was always on a boat. There's a lot of halachot that you learn about. Can you do things on a boat, like a sukkah on a boat, and all types of things? And Rabban Gamliel was always on a boat. Why was he on a boat? He was on a boat because he was traveling from Israel to Rome. He as Rabban Gamliel's family, that family, Shimon ben Gamliel, Gamliel the first, that family were descendants of Beit Hillel. So when we think about, there was obviously, the story goes that ultimately a bat kol, the heavenly voice, came out and definitively poskin like Beit Hillel, but we could understand that there was a general inclination towards the position of his family. That Beit Hillel was the great grandfather of Rabban Gamliel and of Ima Shalom, and Rabban Gamliel was thrust in this position of being the first Nasi post Korban, of trying to put the pieces together, trying to maintain or create continuity in the aftermath of the destruction. And how do you go about that? One of the ways you go about, there's two pieces. Number one, again, focus on the threat outward and the threat inward. Focused on the threat outward, the Judeo-Christian threat. Rabban Gamliel was the one that urged Shmuel HaKatan to write that 19th bracha of the Amidah, Shmon Esrei, V'lo Mal Shinim, which is a prayer to protect us against literally those who report on us, but it's a reference to early Christianity, that there was this real threat that it would undermine Judaism. So that's Rabban Gamliel facing the threat outward, and inwardly, Rabban Gamliel is the one whom we are told, in order to maintain a unity within the Jewish community and the halachic community, did not tolerate any type of differences in practice, right? In other words, you can believe something different, but at the end of the day, the halacha has to follow one opinion, right? So the story from the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the first source number one on your source sheet, is the story of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua with a dispute about how to calculate the new moon, creating a situation whereby Rabbi Yoshua was going to observe Yom Kippur a day later than what Rabban Gamliel had announced and decreed. And Rabban Gamliel was unwilling to accept this live and let live, right? Okay, so my Yom Kippur will be today, his Yom Kippur will be tomorrow. Rabban Gamliel said, in the long term, that's a recipe for disaster. It's just not sustainable. And so therefore, Rabban Gamliel intervened and demanded that Rabbi Yoshua present himself on the day that he calculated as Yom Kippur, the day after Yom Kippur, according to Rabban Gamliel, with his wallet and his walking stick, indicating that he's not observing the day as Yom Kippur. Right? This was a harsh sort of way of dealing with it, but difficult times call for drastic measures and a real clear unity within the halachic realm of Jewish practice. It's therefore not surprising that we find sort of the first story of Ima Shalom, not chronologically, but in our source sheet, of Ima Shalom and her brother taking on a philosopher, understood to be a Christian philosopher. Rabbi Gamliel, as we mentioned, had identified this threat and asked that a prayer be written that God should protect us from this threat. And here we see that Ima Shalom was involved in an interaction, confrontation, if you will, with such an individual. So where the story goes, right? Source number 2, that Ima Shalom, again, who's identified as the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, we're getting to that point, but also of Rabbi Gamliel's sister. That's the point we're focused on. And then we're told that there was a Christian philosopher in their neighborhood who disseminated about himself the reputation that he does not accept bribes. Right? So he was positioning himself as an alternative judicial system, right? They wanted to mock him and reveal his true nature. So she privately gave him a golden lamp as a bribe. And she and her brother came before him, approaching him as if they were seeking judgment. She said to this judge, philosopher, I want to share in the inheritance of my father's estate. We know that technically, according to the Torah, that in the presence of brothers, of sons, a daughter does not inherit. We also know that the rabbis sort of intervened and kind of fixed that system by allowing for the possibility of working around the laws of Yerusha, by allowing for a person to set up his estate in such a way where there is the ability for daughters to receive a portion of the property of the parent, but not as Yerusha. Right? Yerusha has laws, but if you were to say give away your estate before you die, you're allowed to do whatever you want with it. Right? So there was a workaround that was created, but that's not what she's talking about here. She's talking about the laws of inheritance should be altered. I want a share of inheritance in my father's estate. So this judge said, divide it. So Rabbi Gamliel said, but it's written in the Torah where there's a son, the daughter does not inherit. And the philosopher said back, since the day you were exiled from your land, the Torah of Moses was taken away, and Avon Gilyo, the Evangeline, was given in its place. And it's written there, a son and a daughter shall inherit alike. Okay, so he said, no, the Torah of Moshe has been superseded, right, by the new law. And the new law is that sons and daughters inherit alike. The next day, Rabbi Gamliel brought the philosopher a donkey. And Rabbi Gamliel and his sister came before the philosopher for judgment. He said, I changed my mind, right? At the end of this Evangeline, the quote is, I did not come to subtract from the Torah. I did not come to add to the Torah at all, right? That's a saying from Jesus, right? I've not come to add, I've come to fulfill the law, right? And therefore, where there's a son, a daughter does not inherit, right? So when he was smeared by the daughter, he said the daughter gets to inherit. And when he was given a bigger bribe by the son, he changed his mind. So they called him on it, and it said, she said to him, may your light shine like a lamp. I remember the lamp I gave you. And Rabbi Gamliel, her brother, said, the donkey came and kicked the lamp. After I gave him a donkey, he doesn't care about your stinking lamp, right? Because the donkey's worth a lot more, right? So we see this interaction between Ima. It's a little bit humorous. By the way, some like to point out that this is an instance where they're at least grappling with the issue of a daughter and her inheritance. And although, of course, ultimately the Torah does not change, right? But the ability to find a way for daughters to share in a way other than Yerusha is ultimately accepted, right? But so there's a little bit of humor here, but there's also this idea of calling out a threat that existed at that time, and brother and sister do so together. Right? Ima Shalom is an integral piece of this story, and she sort of is an equal partner in Rabbi Gamliel's plot and effort to discredit this Christian judge. So that's Ima Shalom and her family, right? Daughter of Shimon ben Gamliel, who was killed during the Roman, the Great Jewish Revolt. Sister of Rabbi Gamliel. We talked about Rabbi Gamliel. We saw where brother and sister interact together, Ima Shalom and Rabbi Gamliel. We also know, and even in this source in Shabbat 116, we see that she's introduced as the wife of Rabbi Eliezer. Who's this Rabbi Eliezer? none other than Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. We know a lot about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Eliezer, also referred to as Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, Rabbi Eliezer the Great, again living in the 1st century CE. And the story of Avat Rav Natan tells a little bit about the background story about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Seems that he was not given a Jewish education, was not the son of a rabbi. He was the son of Hyrcanus, right? Like a Romanized name, right? It wasn't until he was 22 years old that he was searching for himself, right? 22, he was just done with college, right? Wanted to know what to do next with life. So he wanted to go learn with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And his father was very against it. He said, that's not a plan, right? That's not, when are you going to become a rabbi? It's not a job for a nice Jewish boy, right? So he protested and he said, first go plow the field, right? First do it, which was a rich landowner. And Rabbi Eliezer is understood from elsewhere to be his youngest child. So he went but finally he disobeys his father basically and goes to learn in yeshiva. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that we know, right? Spoke with Vespasian, ultimately is what ultimately gets the Roman emperor to agree to save the yeshiva of Yavne, or allow them to create the yeshiva in Yavne, right? Or maintain that yeshiva. So he went to learn with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is probably prior to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and he became a great student. Okay, one of the top students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We're going to see in the Mishnah Navot how he's described, but in very laudatory terms, a very advanced student. Story goes on page 2 towards the end of this that source, that you'll see that Hyrcanus, who was both Rabbi Eliezer's father's name and son's name, as we'll see later on, Hyrcanus goes. He says, I'm going to go to the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and I'm going to disinherit. I'm going to write him out of the will. I'm going to write Eliezer out of the will. So we go, and he wants to do it in front of Beit Din, because it has to be sort of a Maisa Beit Din. It has to be done, in front of the judges to make it the real deal. So he goes, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "Wait a second, come to the shir. I want you to hear who's speaking." And it ends up being his son Eliezer. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is kissing him after every word he says. All the other students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai are giving him the utmost respect. Hyrcanus is so impressed by how much his son has developed. He says, I changed my mind. I want to give my whole estate to you. Rabbi Eliezer, the end of the story is Rabbi Eliezer says, thanks, but no thanks. I'll take my share, and that's it. But, the father changed his mind. The parent changed his mind after seeing the success of the son and seeing how far Eliezer had come by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Just note that he was already 22 years old, and the indication is that he had not yet learned Torah. And the question you might want to ask yourself, and we'll offer a suggestion, a theory: why now? Why does he want to go now? What's going on? What's going on at home? We can't know for sure, but in a few sources we will offer a suggestion, a theory. What do we know about Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Ima Shalom's husband? So we know Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 great students, the best 5 students, and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was described, source number 4, as a plaster cistern with loses not a drop. Right? He retained everything. Maybe that's how he caught up. He wasn't learning until he was 22, but he was like a genius. Everything he heard, he remembered. Right? Not so much like now we talk about a photographic memory, but you have to have books to have a photographic memory, right? So it was like a audio memory, right? Everything he heard, he remembered, right? Slightly different. And so much so that Yochanan said, if all the sages of Israel were on the scale of the balance on one side and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus on the other, he would outweigh them all, right? He's heavier. He's a greater scholar than all the other scholars. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, you know the story in Gittin. I give you a piece of it on source number 5, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when things are looking bad, when the siege of Jerusalem has become severe and it's not looking good, so the Zealots wanted to fight the Romans, and the rabbinic community wanted to negotiate and to make peace. And so the suggestion was that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai should sneak himself out of Jerusalem and negotiate with Vespasian. And that's what they do. He hides in a coffin, and they sneak him out. Who's carrying that coffin? His two students, right? Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So Ima Shalom's husband was right there as these events are unfolding. We learn in the Gemara Avodah Zarah that just as, whereas we see from Rabbi Gamliel that he was fighting against heresy, against outside influences, heretical influences, Christian influences into the Jewish community. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus also had to deal with that. Source number 6 is the Gemara Avodah Zarah. Source number 6 is Rabbi Eliezer is the Gemara Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara Avodah Zarah tells a story that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was arrested by the Romans and charged with heresy. Because remember, early Christianity, the Jews were not fans of Christians, and the Romans were not fans of Christians. That's why they were crucifying Christians and Jews, but they were crucifying Christians also, right? So Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Ima Shalom's husband, was arrested as a Christian heretic, right? And he was brought a tribunal to the judge, right? And that judge, Hegemon, right? Hegemon said, right, why should you be involved in heresy? What's your defense? Rabbi Eliezer said something very ambiguous, right? Hadayan Naaman, right? The judge is trustworthy, right? And so it just depends on who you mean by the judge, right? Which judge, lowercase j or the capital J, right? Are we talking about the judge of the case, which is what the Roman judge thought he meant? He said, "Oh, you're speaking so nicely about me. You're allowed to go free." But he meant Hashem, right? So right, it's good sometimes. It's good to be ambiguous, purposeful and ambiguity. Why was he arrested? We don't know. It's very possible that he was arrested for being a teacher, right? They didn't really care what you were evangelizing, but you were out there. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was certainly out there, but we don't necessarily know exactly how that came about. But we can see that would be, again, we don't know the chronology of when he got married versus when this happened. But Ima Shalom and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus had similar values, right? Their value of maintaining the authenticity of the Jewish tradition, and calling out or being aware of threats to that authenticity. Something else we learn about Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is he had a certain bias against, or a certain perspective, philosophy towards women. I don't want to say against women, but it might be against women, right? Right. So he's the one that says, whoever teaches their daughter Torah teaches them debauchery, tiflut. You've heard that before, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So that's Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Now, in his defense, in context, look at the context at the source number 7. Where did he say that? He said that specifically as it relates to Sota in response to a statement by Ben Azai. Ben Azai said, one is obligated to teach his daughter Torah. Why? So that if she should ever drink the waters of Sota, the Torah that she learned would be a protection for her and either prevent or delay the deleterious impact of the waters of Sota. So Rabbi Eliezer says, well, that's the reason why women should learn. You're going to teach your daughters Torah so that if they are unfaithful or almost potentially unfaithful, that they'll be protected from the waters of Sota. That didn't sit right with Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And therefore he says, based on what you said, Ben Azai, you're basically teaching them Torah so that they're more comfortable putting themselves in compromising situations, right? So we don't necessarily, from that source in context, again, it's not nice, certainly from our sensibilities, from our perch in the 21st century, 2023. right? It's not something we would say. It's not something we believe, but just understand the context of that statement in context from Ben Azai. The next statement is more clear what his feelings are towards women. A lady asked Rabbi Eliezer, this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, I'm sorry, why were there three different punishments for those who were involved in the sin of the golden calf? Right? And Eliezer ben Hyrcanus responds, the wisdom of a woman is only in her spinning rod, quoting a pasuk. In other words, stick to domestic chores, don't get involved in Torah. And it ends up that his son Hyrcanus, right? Rabbi Eliezer's father was Hyrcanus, his son was also Hyrcanus. So his son Hyrcanus said to him, they were Kohanim. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was a Kohen. And this woman would often give them, she was very, very wealthy, and she would give them her priestly gifts, priestly mamatnat kahuna that she had to give from her agriculture and from her livestock. She would normally give to the Hyrcanus family, but now not anymore. There goes my donation, right? But still, Rabbi Eliezer, so he says, Dad, Abba, right? You just lost us out on a big piece of our income. To which he responded, bottom of page 2, may the words of the Torah be burned, right, and not be delivered to women. Wow, right? I mean that's pretty clear, right? It's hard for me to, even in context, that's not so. There's no Ben Azai, on that one to sort of frame it. That's what he said, and furthermore, it gets worse because the woman leaves, right? She exits the scene, and his students ask the question, right? They ask the same question, and he gives them an answer, right? If there were witnesses, they were executed by the court. If there were witnesses but no warning, they had to drink the waters that Moshe prepared. And if there were no witnesses and no warning, they died from the plague. So it was a good question. It was Torah, right? And still, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus had this response. We can't really know why, but here's an interesting sort of follow-up. Again, chronologically, I can't tell you that it happened before. I can't tell you that it happened afterwards. But look at this top of page 3, the first source number 8, where we have the Yerushalmi in Yevamot. Yerushalmi in Yevamot tells us a backstory that happened. Well, actually, we do know when this takes place. The backstory is this takes place while Eliezer is in his home, before he's 22, right? At 22, he leaves home. This is before he left home. And what do we read? It happened that Rabbi Eliezer's mother pushed him to marry his niece, right? She wanted him to marry his niece. We know that a man can marry his niece, a woman can't marry her. A man can marry his niece, right? And that's, but a man can't marry his aunt, right? But you can marry her niece. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus's mother wanted him to do. You don't have to worry about the other side, right? It's a smaller wedding list. I don't know. There's a lot of potential, thinking of it in 21st century terms. But, and while she was still a minor, we know that there was this idea of Kedusha Katana that existed in those times. So he told her, go and get married, right? And they plotted to make this happen. Could it be that, and even when he married her, he waited, right? He was not on board with this. Could it be, and this is not Ima Shalom, right? This is sort of his first wife. Again, nowhere does it say that he divorced her and moved on and went somewhere else, right? We don't have any of that information or indication, but we do know that there was this story. We do know that he leaves. We do know that he was not happy with what the scheme that his mother was trying to concoct in order for him to marry his niece. And then we see his negative attitude towards women, right? Is it, I don't want to go so far as to say it's a mommy issue, but there is this, right? These are the pieces, right? These are the pieces. And so we begin to create a composite. But what we do see is one last piece before we go into the stories of Ima Shalom and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and this is a rather well-known story that entails Rabbi Eliezer, and you may not have realized it, but it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus in the famous story about Mitzvah about the Tanor Shalachnai. Right, the story is the details are in source number 9, where it tells us that it's a typical dispute. Before I get into that, let me just point out, because I pointed out before, that Ima Shalom and Rabbi Gamliel were children of Shimon ben Gamliel and Gamliel the First, the grandchildren of Gamliel the First, who were descendants of Beit Hillel. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was a diehard Beit Shammai, right? He very much, not just in terms of the position that he felt was more correct halachically, but also we know that Hillel believed more in compromise, in peace, in getting along with people, in being willing to take other factors into consideration. And Shammai was harsher, right? Shammai said, "This is the deal. There's no compromise. There's no bending. This is how it is, and this is how it should be." And so it's interesting that that he married into that family, into the family of Beit Hillel. Ultimately, we know that Beit Hillel is the one that we follow for the most part. But so here, just the setup, without going into the details of the case of Tanor Shalachnai, what we see is that even though Rabbi Eliezer was a diehard Beit Shammai guy, and Beit Shammai was normally the no man, right? He would say, no, Asur, right? Tameh, right? Here, Rabbi Eliezer decided in this case of this oven that it's pure, right? So you can, again, this is not based on any text nor on any commentary, but you could imagine, right? Walk with me in your imagination for a moment. The bad guy, who's always the no guy, who was always telling them no, right? We have to be strict. Finally, comes to a case where he can be with everyone else and say it's okay, tahor, right? And what does everyone else say? Tameh. No. Say, no, sorry, you're on the wrong. Even when he thought he was moving to the right side of things, everyone else moved too, and he's on the wrong side of things. So what happens? The story goes on to say he went to great lengths to prove that he was right. He created a number of miracles. Right? He had carob trees flying through the air. He had all types of miracles going on because he would say, if I'm right, these miracles will occur, and all the miracles occurred. And he went so far as to say, if I'm right, heaven will prove it. And a divine voice came down and in fact said, we hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And you know what the rabbi said? Famously, Lo Bashamayim He. With all due respect, God, divine voice, right? Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe, it's in our hands now, right? And everybody maintain their boundaries. And they said, Lo Bashamayim He. So the rest of that story is, well, not the whole rest, but the next part of that story is the rabbinic community, including Rabbi Gamliel, excommunicated Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. You can go back if you want to go online on the YouTube a couple of years ago, last year, 2 years ago. I gave a series called Bans from the Beit Midrash. One of the people in the Bans of the Beit Midrash series was none other than Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So that's Ima Shalom's husband, right? So he, at some point in his life, what do we see about Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? He was strong-willed. He had some unpopular, not politically correct opinions about women, and in the one normally he held like Beit Shammai, which was not the family tradition of Ima Shalom, but in one instance that he seemed to go over to the light side, he was rejected and ultimately excommunicated. What do we know about now let's go to some of the interactions between Ima Shalom and her husband, right? So these next two are fascinating because they're sort of two sides of the same coin. Just sort of, as much as, yes, black on white, we said that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus had some, what we would call misogynistic views on women. What we see here is if you put them together, there's almost like a parody between Ima Shalom and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. What do I mean by that? Look at source number 10 on page 3. The Gemara in Eruvin, Rabbi Eliezer had a certain disciple who issued a halachic ruling in his presence. This is also a Medrash Rabbah on Parshat Shmini about the death of Nadav and Avihu. And one of the many opinions on why Nadav and Avihu died is because they were mora halacha lifnei Rabbah, right? That they didn't wait for their turn. They were next in line to be leadership in the Jewish community, but they were unwilling to wait. Even one of the Midrashim goes to say, they would say, when is Moshe and Aaron going to die so that it's our turn? They didn't wait their turn, right? You have to have, there's a certain order of operations and a certain respect that has to go for those that are there. So along those similar lines, Medrash Rabbah and Eruvin says, a similar thing happened to Rabbi Eliezer where he had a student who paskined in his presence. Rabbi Eliezer didn't say anything to this student, but he turned to Ima Shalom, his wife, and said, I'll be surprised if this one lives until the end of the year. And so it was that he died within the year. Ima Shalom says, are you a prophet? He said to her, I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet, but I have a tradition that anyone who issues a halachic ruling in the teacher's presence is liable to the death penalty, has forfeited his right to continue to live. Right? So in that story, we have Rabbi Eliezer, who has this sort of what seems like a prophecy. Ima Shalom is out of the loop. She asked that, what? She's like, wow, how did you know that? And Rabbi Eliezer says, I have a tradition. Look at the next source. Look at Bava Metzia. Look at the, this is the rest of the story after, we're going to see a couple of Gemaras about what happened after Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was excommunicated, right? He's ostracized. He's pushed away from the community of the rabbis. He's no longer able to go to the yeshiva. He's no longer allowed to give shiur. He's no longer asked questions. It's over for him. So what happens, right? So this is sort of the rest of the story. After Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is excommunicated, right? From that, I'm reading at the end of the first line in source 11. From that incident forward, Ima Shalom would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to recite Tachnun. Right? Why? So Rashi explains, because she feared that her husband during Tachnun, which is a very auspicious time for prayers to be accepted, would complain about his lot in life, that he's been ostracized, according to him, unfairly. It's always unfairly, right? And therefore, it would be the indictment would be against the Nasi, who just so happened to be Ima Shalom's brother, right? So she's sort of in a because even if Rabban Gamliel was not the one who initiated the cherem, the ban, he maintained it. He continued it. So she's worried about this. So we have this whole story that a certain day was around the day of Rosh Chodesh, right? But she thought it was Rosh Chodesh, but it really wasn't Rosh Chodesh, right? So she thought nothing to worry about, no Tachnun. Really, there was Tachnun. Another on page 4, another version of that story is that some say that he finished Shmona Esrei and she got busy. A poor person came to the door. She took care of that poor person, right? Showing her benevolence, right? And the result was that he said Tachnun. Right? Rav Elyashiv suggests it's not that she prevented him from saying Tachnun, but she prevented him from going from Shmona Esrei to Tachnun uninterrupted. She would always interrupt him. And Rav Elyashiv suggested that the power of Tachnun is when it's directly connected to the Shmona Esrei. If there's a break in between, it's not quite as potent. Either way you cut it, right? She wasn't able to accomplish that feat that day. And what happens? Immediately upon seeing her husband do Tachnun, right? Either lay down flat or lay down on an arm like we do it, right? She said to him, you killed my brother, right? And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm just sitting here, right? And what is he? And he's like, what do you mean? And then he hears the shofar blow. Shofar blow was an indication back in the day, without a phone tree or without a constant contact, right? That indeed Rabbi Gamliel had in fact died, And Rabbi Eliezer asked, how did you know? Right? See the parallels, right? Before Ima Shalom was like, how do you know that he's going to die? Now Rabbi Eliezer in the dark. How do you, Ima Shalom, know that he's going to die? That he was going to die? Your brother was going to die. So she said to him, there's a tradition that I received from the house of my father's father, right? From Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who got it from Rabbi Gamliel, that all the gates of heaven are locked except for the gates of a person, the victim of verbal mistreatment, right? A person who's been wounded. And therefore you, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, had a certain power in your prayer that when it was recited at the right time in the right fashion was an indictment on my brother, and that led to his demise. So we have these interesting parallel Talmudic statements. One where Ima Shalom's in the dark, one where her husband's in the and Rabbi Eliezer fills in the details, one where Rabbi Eliezer in the dark about why it happens, and where she's teaching him Torah. Right? It's like Rabbi Eliezer, in Rabbi Eliezer's defense, he could have said, listen, I said women shouldn't, you shouldn't teach Torah to women, but if they teach you Torah, right, then maybe it's okay, right? She was teaching him Torah. He wasn't teaching her Torah. I don't know. Maybe that's a possibility. But nonetheless, we have this very interesting Gemara. And as we move on, we see that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus embraced this idea that Ima Shalom was in fact a person of value in the halachic system, right? So the Gemara in Nida, page 48b, tells the story of tells us that there were for practical purposes there was a need to confirm when a girl reached the age of adulthood, puberty, and that Rabbi Eliezer would have these girls examined by Ima Shalom. Right, so Ima Shalom was an integral part, at least in that halacha, of the halachic determination. Right, so would Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus say that about every woman? Right, it's kind of easy to generalize when you're not talking about anyone in particular. And then he'd be like, "Oh, I didn't mean Ima Shalom. Ima Shalom's different. Ima Shalom comes from a line of rabbis. Ima Shalom had certain traditions that she maintained. Ima Shalom was a stalwart defender of authentic Judaism at a time when it came under attack by Judeo-Christians, etc. Ima Shalom's different. Right? We hear that all too often when people make generalizations. Just a couple more items about Ima Shalom and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. They had beautiful children. Source number 13 tells us Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Ima Shalom had beautiful children. Let's assume it. And when asked why, she tells us she goes into some detail about their intimacy, their intimate life, right? And how you can read it on your own, but the idea being is that Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus gave his full attention to his wife, right? When they were together, in that moments of intimacy, he was careful. He was extraordinarily careful to avoid any types of distractions, right? And that was really important to him, and that's something that she appreciated and identified with a merit. Right, a merit for the couple was that these beautiful children came about because in moments of intimacy there was this intense focus without any type of distraction. Right, so Ima Shalom, there's no she's not quoting her husband. She's suggesting that this was the merit, that this was the activity, the merit that caused them to have this blessing from Hashem, these beautiful children, right? So we see Ima Shalom interpreting, being the beneficiary of a marriage where husband and wife were focused on each other, and also being the conveyor of this lesson within the Gemara and Nedarim, right? So she is part of the oral tradition, right? As much as her husband might have said, right, don't teach women Torah, right? Ima Shalom teaches him something, and Ima Shalom is the conduit for teaching this lesson about appropriate marital focus and communication and quality time and making sure that there's no distractions. Right. So she despite her husband's feelings about women in general, Ima Shalom plays these important roles. One last point, and then maybe we could just summarize. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, another point we're told, this is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, source number 14, tells a little bit more of the after story after Rabbi Eliezer is ostracized and excommunicated from the rabbinic community, so he sort of has to live by himself. And he took ill towards the end of his life, and it wasn't just a physical illness, it seems to have been a mental illness. By the way, just to fill in the details, soon before his death, some of the rabbis wanted to visit him, and even while he was, and perhaps explore the possibility of removing the excommunication, the cherem, and he asked them, "What took you so long?" And they try to explain themselves, and it goes on to say that Rabbi Eliezer said, "You're going to be punished for what you did, and Rabbi Akiva will be punished the worst." And in fact, those students of his or those colleagues of his were those who were mentioned in Sarah Rugi Malchut, right? The 10 martyrs. There were more than that over the course of time, post 70 CE, post the destruction of the temple, right? Rabbi Eliezer was a bit of a voice there, right? So it's a little bit of that's not really our topic. We're to focus on Ima Shalom, but sort of, were they right? Was Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus right? Were they right? Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was very committed to his opinion, even at the risk of being a minority opinion. And what we said before is Rabbi Gamliel was very concerned with ensuring the cohesiveness and the unity of Jewish practice. So which one's right? It's sort of left as ambiguous. In life, things are complicated. So Rabbi Eliezer is ostracized. He dies lonely. He foreshadows that those who put him into cherem will also be punished in a terrible way, and that also comes to fruition, right? So it's left as an ambiguity. But what we see in Sanhedrin 68a, right? Rabbi Eliezer was ill, and Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues came to visit him. This is the story around which it talks about Rabbi Eliezer foreshadowing terrible punishments coming to his colleagues. He was sitting on a canopied bed in the parlor, and it was Friday, and Rabbi Eliezer's son Hyrcanus came to take off his father's tefillin, right? Remember back then, those who wore tefillin were wear tefillin all day until nighttime every night. It was an all day, like tzitzis. You'd wear tefillin all day. Certainly those who were involved in Torah study all day. So you took them off before night, and you took him off Friday before Shabbos. So Hyrcanus, the son of Rabbi Eliezer, comes to take off his tefillin, and his father reprimanded him, right? And he turns to he thinks he's a crazy old man, right? So Hyrcanus says to the people in the room, "Pay no attention to my father. He obviously is a crazy old man. He's giving me a hard time for taking off his tefillin on Friday afternoon. That's what you're supposed to do." To which Rabbi Eliezer heard this and said to them, "Hyrcanus, right? I'm not the crazy ones. You're the crazy ones, right? You and your mother are crazy." Right? Who's his mother? Hyrcanus' mother is Ima Shalom, right? And he gives a reason why. Why are you worried about my tefillin? If I have my tefillin on Shabbos, it's only a d'Rabbanan, it's only a rabbinic violation. Be more worried about, turning on the lights, turning on the fire, turning off the fire, right? Those things are Torah violations, right? So I don't know how to interpret this other than, you can just admit, right? This is sometimes the sad situation at a later stage of a person's illness, especially if it's impacted them mentally. But we also see that Ima Shalom stuck with him, right? That she's with him. She's a caretaker, along with the son, along with Hyrcanus. Ima Shalom is his caretaker, even when she is, right? So there's two types. There's two ways in which she's subjected to Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. One is at the end of his life, when he calls her crazy, but also sort of knowing that I don't know if she knew it, but so Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was able to compartmentalize, right, for better or for worse, right? What we see, I'm just reading what we just learned together, right? On the one hand, sort of in the abstract, when it came to the woman he didn't know, he has very harsh words about women, and yet when it came to his wife, right, your wife's not just a woman, your wife's your wife, right? He was very caring, he was very loving, right? He had incredible focus and attention, including and especially during intimacy, and she stuck with him, even at the end of his life. Whether or not she knew his opinion in general about these other stories about what he said about women, unclear. We don't really know one way or the other. But even at the end of the life, when he lashed out at her, right, perhaps due to his age, perhaps due to his frustration, perhaps due to some sort of mental debilitation, she's there with him. She's with him anyway, right? This ability at times for difficult people to also for spouses to overlook. But every spouse has to overlook something in their spouse, right? And Ima Shalom, certainly the picture we paint is one where she is willing to do so. So just to conclude, just with a few minutes left, start with where we began. Understanding who Ima Shalom was includes understanding who her brother was, Rabbi Gamliel, who her husband was, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, understanding the times in which she lived in. She lived through the Churban Beit HaMikdash. She lived through all of that trauma in the Jewish community and the uncertainty that existed. Will Judaism survive, right, in the absence of a temple? What are the assurances? What are the steps that have to be taken? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was her husband's Rebbe, took a number of those steps, right? He shifted things. A number of the takanot of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai were takanot that moved us away from the temple and allowed us to imagine vibrant Jewish life in the absence of a Beit HaMikdash, right? So you take the lulav and etrog, not just in the Beit HaMikdash for 7 days, but even in shul 7 days. Right? That was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. There's a number of takanot like that allowed us to move on, but it was not a sure thing. It was uncharted territory. This is the world from just due to the Churban and due to these pressures, Roman pressures, Christian pressures, internal pressures, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, all of this was going on that helps us add some color to the sources that we have about Ima Shalom. I would say from me, this was very eye-opening. I don't know much. I knew a little bit about Bruria. I knew who Yalta was. Ima Shalom, I didn't know anything about. It's just very eye-opening, not just to learn the texts that talk about Ima Shalom straight out, but to begin to add color to those texts and motivation and context to those texts as a result of knowing where she came from, who her family was, both family of origin and her married family, and the times in which she lived. Any questions?
Yes, it's possible that he was needling the rabbi. In other words, what's the fear? What took you so long? And my son should be concerned with rabbinic prohibitions, present company.
Oh, that's cute. In other words, don't worry about the tefillin. The tefillin is something they said, and who cares about them? That's cute. Yeah, that's interesting. I hear that. Right, there's no right. I mean, Hyrcanus, right? His son. I mean, this happens. You can read this Gemara very clearly in terms of real life, right? You have a family that's serving as caretakers for a relative who's ill, and there's a lot of love there. Obviously, there's some tension there as well, and all that comes to the forefront. And to the extent to which, they're probably both right, and they're also probably both misinterpreting things to some degree. Yeah. Yes.
I didn't understand this
Evangeline. Yeah.
So what is that?
It seems to have been either some book or some early.
Is that where evangelical comes from?
Yeah.
So, okay, so it's a book of early Christian thought.
Right. Either or laws or it's.
So what is
No, so I don't think it's a Hebrew word.
Oh, so it's just this Latin.
Yeah,
It refers to a book, but it's lower.
right,
The only paper in our bone, if you spell it with an iron, would be a sin.
Right.
They don't even call it a sin.
right,
It could be that, that was
Yeah.
editorializing on behalf of the tomorrow.
right,
Like the
right.
But, okay, but if that's the origin of the word evangelical.
It is, yeah, yeah, that's right.
Who made this shit up?
Who made Emo Shaw? Right.
I thought we were. She comes from a family from.
Oh, Hillel lights.
How did they allow, back in the day?
Maybe we
How did they allow him to marry?
made this shit up.
Right, I mean,
He was from.
He was, his married boy. And, Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol was dedicated